Hello, my name is Michael Forsman. I am Associate Professor in Media and Communication Studies at Södertörn University in Stockholm, Sweden. I'm also head of the department. My talk here today is meant to be a preparatory post for the seminar on mediatization and the construction of knowledge and the university, which is part of the upcoming conference on mediatized sapiens. My interest lies in what impact that mediatization has on the classroom and on education, and especially media education. So far, I've mainly done historically oriented research about this, especially in Sweden, most recently in a project called Mediatization and the Media Citizen, Curriculum, Teaching Materials, Teacher Education. However, it is not this project I'm going to talk about here today. Instead, I want to address some questions under the metaphor, the critical mindset, which is a discussion about the role of critical thinking and critical consciousness within higher education. I will now start sharing my screen with you. Okay, I have called this talk No Place for the Critical Mindset, Critical Thinking and Critical Consciousness in the Changing Media Ecology of Higher Education. I start by stating the obvious. With deep mediatization and ubiquitous digitalization comes challenges to the construction of knowledge at the university. One example of this is how we understand and train our students in terms of critical thinking, for example, in courses of media critique, or how we help them raise their critical awareness or critical consciousness in the long run. As we know, the term critique is related to kritikos, which in classical Greek stood for a thinking technique for distinguishing and making evaluations, as well as reaching verdicts. It also denoted a diagnosis of the critical turning point in a process of illness. Within modern philosophy and as part of enlightenment, critique became aligned with consciousness, self-awareness, and reflection. For example, in Immanuel Kant's famous credo, enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-imposed knowledge. This credo still directs much of our ideals around critical thinking and critical consciousness, and some of us may still acknowledge Karl Marx's appeal for ruthless criticism of all that exists, as well as the impact from critical theory and the Frankfurt schools in discussion on cultural industries, political economy, and ideology, or for that matter, cultural studies and discourses on hegemony, resistance, and identity. But what does criticality stand for today? In a climate of post-truth and in an era that has been described as a post-critical condition. Today, anyone and everyone can be a critic, at least online, simply by acting out as a consumer, fan, social media user, or should we say prosumer. At least in a country like Sweden, critical thinking could also be described as part of a dominant ideology, or even as a code of conduct, as Foucault put it in his talk, What is Critique? This means that critique has somehow become an integrated part in the biopolitics and governance of citizen making, for example, through the curriculum for compulsory education. Perhaps also so for higher education, at least in a welfare media democracy like Sweden, while many other countries is far from this. And today we must also consider the challenges that come from authoritarianism, populism, and conspiracy theories. In Sweden, we can otherwise note that critical thinking is described as one of the necessary 21st century skills, and thus related to keywords like employability and lifelong learning. This is, for example, true in association with concepts like digital competence or media and information literacy. These concepts emanate from the policy circuits of EU, OECD, and UNESCO. They can be referred to as so-called loose concepts, which means that they can be used by different agents in different contexts for somewhat different purposes, while at the same time upholding and manifesting certain underlying interests and values like individualism, consumerism, technological progression, and freedom of the market, rather than social justice, sustainability, or redistribution of power. Now these concepts seem to enter also into higher education. This is the background to my trope, the critical mindset. I use this neologism to combine two related but also somewhat separated concepts. Critical thinking refers to cognitive skill that help individuals act and think in a rational way, for example, in making unbiased and skeptical analysis, by the evaluation of external data and propositions, through the testing of the validity and plausibility with the means of falsification and rational reasoning. This could be described as a generic knowledge and understood in taxonomic terms, and it should be trained as a specific skill, for example, through criticism of sources and analysis of scientific data and statistics. Critical thinking is thus linked to rationality and logics and foundational for a cognitivist and functionalist epistemology, also within media education and media literacy. Whereas critical consciousness refers to non-alienated self-awareness based on the perception and illumination of underlying social and political contradictions, in combination with the capacity to take concrete and communal action against social injustices and illegitimate forms of power. This is a process related to self-authorization and to an emancipatory epistemology. In media studies, we can perhaps find it related to rhetorical analysis, visual analysis, discursive analysis, and different modes of interpretive approaches. Consciousness can perhaps be seen as a more personal thing than critical thinking, since it has to do with the process of being and becoming aware of yourself and your own agency as a social and historical subject. Consciousness is, so to speak, about being not unconscious, meaning being not naive, not duped, and not the carrier of a false consciousness. Thus, consciousness, especially critical consciousness, denotes something existential and potentially political. And it is a step away from a naive form of consciousness to a more transitative consciousness. This ideal is often associated with critical and emancipatory pedagogics, and hence connected to the work of Brazilian philosopher, pedagogue, and literacy activist, Paulo Freire. In his book, Education for Critical Consciousness, Freire describes the realization of the critical consciousness, or in Portuguese, excuse my pronunciation here, conscientização, as a willingness to problematize what otherwise is considered as natural or given. This development of the awakening of critical awareness should also include the potential to take action against oppressive elements in your own life and in society at large. I suggest that we could see this as a part of the qualification, socialization, and subjectification of what we might call the emerging media citizen. This term suggests a social subject who in a reflective and responsible way communicate, produce, and consume media within the current media ecology, but at the same time hold the capacity to be and become a historically aware, critically thinking, and democratically engaged subject. That together with others is prepared to take action for social change through progressive mediated action. We have already touched on some of the challenges that today is facing this ideal we might call a classical critical mindset. We have mentioned that new media technologies affect younger generations and younger media generations in their understandings of criticality. We have also addressed the challenges that criticality face in today's post-critical condition, where it tends to become equalized with an individualized prosumer skill. Other challenges to the classical version of the critical mindset, and thus to the university in its construction of knowledge, might be the following. The combination of datafication and learnification. This has a lot to do with digitalization and commercialization and the forces of new public management, now moving strong into the educational sector. It is also related to what educational philosopher Gert Bista called learnification and the new language of learning, where knowledge is equalized with something that is measurable, predictable, segmented, and preferred, and thus applicable to metric standards and datification. And this tendency appeared to be almost the very opposite to the classical idea of the critical mindset, and also negation of what Gert Bista called the great risk of education, which is a term he used to salute the more open knowledge process of Bildung. Another threat we can notice comes from populist right-wing interests that expropriate classical left-wing positions and techniques for media critique. For example, by exploiting terms like hegemony, bias, and misrepresentation in their critique of the dominant media and through their ways of using alternative media production, often in combination with conspiracy theories. Finally, I want to mention that also NGOs and big media corporations can challenge the classical understanding of criticality by offering their concepts and models for how to best train the emerging media citizen on different levels of the educational system. EU has its action plan against disinformation. UNESCO has initiated #FightFakeNews. Even corporate interests like Google, Disney, or Apple are engaged in similar matters with their curriculum for critical thinking. Before we stop, we will just have a quick look at two examples of this last form of challenge, or if you like, intervention. The first one comes from UNESCO. In 2011, UNESCO presented the document Media and Information Literacy, a Curriculum for Teachers, where they address all their more than 190 member states with some principles and objectives for media and information literacy, as well as concrete exercises to be used in the classroom. In this document, the word critical is used 42 times, mainly as one of the legs in critical thinking, while not much is said about matters that somehow could be related to critical consciousness. Several media corporations and platform giants also have their curriculum for media literacy training and how to handle life online, often in close connection to their products, services, and brands. This is just one example. Recently, Google launched an online campaign called Be Internet Awesome. In this campaign for 5 to 8-year-olds, Google used gamification techniques to, quote, teach kids the fundamentals of digital citizenship and safety so they can explore the online world with confidence. One part of this is an, quote, interactive and fun game, end of quote, called Interland, where the player is supposed to learn digital safety and citizenship by helping fellow internauts in combating what is called badly behaved hackers, phishers, oversharers, and bullies. While not much is said, even in a playful way, to something that could be related to a form of critical consciousness. I have in this talk used the metaphor, the critical mindset, to signify something that I consider to be essential for media education and media literacy, also at the university level. However, at least a classical understanding of this could today be said to be under reconstruction. This means that we need new didactics and further reflections around the qualification, socialization, and subjectification of what I call the emerging media citizen. However, without losing the indispensable sides of Bildung and the beautiful risk of education. To conclude, media education should not just be about cultivating flexible and employable workers for the creative media and information industries, nor do we want our students to come out as cynical media observers. The ambition should instead be to ignite agency and social responsibility by exploring how media can be used for civic purposes in a struggle for the common good and a more sustainable future. Okay, thank you for your attention. And goodbye.